December 1944. The snow-covered forests of Western Europe looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But beneath that quiet white blanket, an empire was dying. The Third Reich, once feared across continents, was gasping for air. Its cities lay in ruins, the Luftwaffe was crippled, and the once proud German army was retreating on every front. Yet amid this chaos, Adolf Hitler clung to a vision, a final, desperate gamble to turn back the clock of fate. For months, Allied commanders believed Germany was finished. Their divisions were thinly spread, exhausted but confident. The German army, they thought, no longer had the strength for another offensive. But in the shadows of the Ardennes forest, Hitler planned to prove them wrong. He called the operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. To his generals, it was insanity. To him, it was destiny. The plan was daring. Break through the lightly defended American lines in Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and seize the port of Antwerp. If successful, it would split the Allied armies, stranding the British to the north and forcing the Americans to retreat. Hitler believed such a shock might fracture the alliance entirely, perhaps even win him a negotiated peace. But there was one problem: fuel. The German war machine ran on it, and by late 1944 it was running on fumes. Allied bombers had turned refineries into smoking craters. Synthetic fuel plants were barely functioning. Entire panzer divisions sat motionless for lack of gasoline. The same tanks that once tore across Europe now rusted in the mud. Still, Hitler ordered the attack. It would be his last gamble. One final roll of the dice. Thousands of tanks and armored vehicles were hidden beneath the forest canopy. Every soldier knew the plan hinged on one thing: capturing American fuel depots. Each unit carried only enough fuel for the first thrust. After that, they'd have to live off whatever they captured. It was a strategy of desperation. The men understood the risk. Without fuel, there would be no retreat, no regrouping, no survival. And among them was a seasoned colonel, a veteran of the Eastern Front, loyal but weary. His next mission would lead him to an incredible victory, and an even greater realization that Germany's war was already lost. Wars are fought with courage, but won with logistics. And in 1944, the most valuable weapon wasn't steel or bullets, it was fuel. In World War II, gasoline was more precious than gold. It powered tanks, trucks, planes, and even the factories that built them. Without it, armies couldn't move, planes couldn't fly, and nations couldn't fight. The Allies knew this, and so did the Germans. But while the Allies had almost limitless access to oil fields in the Middle East and the United States, Germany had almost none. Cut off from natural oil reserves, the Nazis had built an elaborate system of synthetic fuel plants, converting coal into gasoline through a process called hydrogenation. It was expensive, inefficient, and vulnerable. Allied bombers knew it too. By 1944, their air raids had crippled 80% of Germany's fuel production. The Reich was bleeding energy faster than it could replace it. The result was catastrophic. Pilots trained in simulators because there wasn't enough fuel for real flights. Tanks were sent into battle with barely half a tank. Even the mighty Tiger II, Germany's most powerful tank, guzzled fuel faster than it could be supplied. Commanders rationed gasoline like medicine. In this context, Hitler's Ardennes offensive was nothing short of madness. It required massive fuel reserves Germany simply didn't have. Still, Hitler insisted that seizing Allied fuel would solve everything. His logic was brutally simple. The Americans had what Germany needed. Take it from them. The soldiers were told the same story, that they'd capture enough Allied fuel to reach Antwerp and win the war. But the officers knew better. Even if they seized every gallon in Belgium, it wouldn't be enough to sustain the offensive. Still, orders were orders. The columns rolled out in the dead of night, engines rumbling through the frozen forest. Men whispered prayers and checked their rifles as they advanced toward the unsuspecting Americans. Every drop of fuel they used brought them closer to either glory or exhaustion. For one colonel and his men, the mission was clear: find and capture Allied fuel depots along the front. What they didn't know was that their brief triumph would become the moment of truth, when the illusion of victory shattered under the weight of reality. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the stillness of the Ardennes erupted into chaos. Thousands of German guns roared at once, pounding American positions in one of the most intense barrages of the war. Operation Wacht am Rhein had begun. Under cover of fog and snow, German tanks and infantry surged forward. Entire American units were caught off guard, many believing the Germans no longer had the strength for an attack. Roads jammed with retreating vehicles. Communications collapsed. It was chaos, and for a fleeting moment the gamble worked. German panzer divisions punched through the front lines, advancing deep into Allied territory. Morale soared. For the first time in months, soldiers believed victory might still be possible. Hitler called it the miracle of the Ardennes. But that miracle came with a ticking clock, one measured in gallons. Every tank, every truck, every half-track burned fuel faster than it could be replaced. Supply lines stretched thin across snowy terrain. Fuel trucks that should have followed behind were either bombed, stuck in the mud, or empty. Commanders were forced to siphon gasoline from destroyed vehicles. Progress slowed. The farther they advanced, the deeper they fell into a logistical trap. Then came the reports. American fuel depots spotted ahead. It was exactly what the Germans needed, and exactly what Hitler had predicted. Capturing them could keep the offensive alive for days, maybe weeks, and leading one of these missions was Colonel Hans Krüger, a disciplined, battle-hardened officer of the Wehrmacht. Krüger's orders were simple but critical. Take a small armored group, strike behind enemy lines, and seize every drop of Allied fuel possible. For him, it wasn't just about obedience, it was about survival. His division's tanks were running dangerously low. With a handful of men and limited ammo, Krüger began his raid, not knowing that this mission would bring him face to face with the truth he had long ignored. The operation began at dawn. Colonel Krüger's unit, a mix of tanks and infantry in American uniforms, moved silently through the fog. It was part of a deception strategy. Operation Greif, where German troops disguised as Allied soldiers to sow confusion behind enemy lines. They struck fast and brutal. Within hours, Krüger's men captured a small American fuel depot near Stavelot. Inside the compound, nearly 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline. It was enough to refuel an entire panzer division. The men cheered. For the first time in weeks, they believed the offensive could continue. Krüger ordered his engineers to start refueling at once. But as the first tank engines roared back to life, he noticed something strange. The nervous excitement among his men didn't last. They were exhausted, half-starved, and freezing. The fuel might have reignited their machines, but not their morale. The colonel stood on a snowy ridge, watching the trucks fill up. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and metallic. For a moment, it felt like a victory. But deep down, Krüger sensed it was hollow. The Americans had more, far more. For every gallon captured here, thousands more waited just beyond reach. The Reich's armies were feeding on scraps while the Allies swam in abundance. And worse, even with 50,000 gallons, the logistics made no sense. Roads were clogged with wrecks, bridges were destroyed. The Luftwaffe no longer had the strength to protect supply routes. Every refueled tank that moved forward did so into a tightening noose. Still, orders came from above. Advance. Push deeper. Take the Meuse. Krüger obeyed. He had no choice. But as his convoy rumbled toward the next town, American aircraft finally pierced the winter fog. The skies filled with thunder. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down like hawks. Within minutes, the depot was burning. Flames devoured the very fuel they had risked everything to capture. The fire lit the snow in shades of orange and black, a haunting reflection of Germany's last hope, going up in smoke. And as Krüger watched, the truth struck him like a bullet. This wasn't victory. It was the death throes of a dying army. That night, Krüger sat alone inside a wrecked farmhouse. The distant rumble of artillery echoed through the frozen woods. His men were asleep, or pretending to be. The captured fuel had given them one more day of fighting, but no one believed it would be enough. He looked at a map spread across a candle-lit table. The red lines showing German advances were already curling inward, collapsing. Every arrow that once symbolized triumph now marked a graveyard of machines that had run dry. The Allies were regrouping fast. The American counterattack was coming. For the first time in his career, Kruger began to question everything. He remembered his early days, the parades, the propaganda, the belief in a united, unstoppable Germany. But now, surrounded by snow, smoke, and silence, all he saw was futility. His country had gambled everything on a fantasy. As dawn broke, orders arrived to move again. But the colonel hesitated. The tanks had fuel, yes, but where would they go? The roads were blocked, the bridges destroyed. The offensive had stalled completely. Even worse, the Americans were now targeting fuel depots directly, ensuring that every captured gallon became a death trap. Kruger finally understood what his superiors wouldn't admit. All that remained was how long the men would keep pretending otherwise. By late December, the Ardennes offensive was collapsing. The once proud German advance had become a retreat through fire and snow. Entire units were encircled. Tanks sat abandoned, their fuel tanks empty, their crews trudging on foot toward the east. Colonel Kruger led what was left of his convoy, a dozen vehicles, half of them damaged. The 50,000 gallons of captured fuel were long gone, consumed or destroyed. What remained were tired men, frozen hands, and the grim awareness that the war was lost. The roads were littered with the remnants of ambition, burnt trucks, shattered guns, and the bodies of men who had believed one more victory was possible. The Allied Air Force dominated the sky, striking anything that moved during daylight. The Germans could only travel at night, headlights off, guided by instinct and fear. Kruger's men fought skirmishes in small villages, holding the line for hours before being overrun. Each engagement cost more lives and burned more fuel they couldn't replace. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. The once glorious panzer divisions were reduced to scattered fragments. Then, near L'Église, Kruger made his last stand. Out of ammunition, low on fuel, and surrounded by American armor, he ordered his men to destroy their own vehicles to prevent capture. Flames rose into the winter sky, a funeral pyre for the last armored hope of the Reich. Kruger watched silently as his beloved tanks burned. Machines that once symbolized German might now stood as monuments to failure. And in that moment, surrounded by defeat, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The illusion was gone. After his surrender, Colonel Kruger was interrogated by American officers. They asked him about the captured fuel, the depot, the numbers, the logistics. He told them everything. But one comment stood out. He said quietly, to him the 50,000 gallons of American fuel represented more than a tactical victory or defeat. It was a symbol, proof that Germany had been fighting a war it could never win. While his men risked their lives for every drop, the Americans treated fuel like water, endless, flowing, reliable. The colonel realized that technology and courage meant nothing without supply. The war wasn't lost in the trenches or on the battlefield. It was lost in the factories, the oil fields, and the skies. Germany's fate had been sealed long before the Ardennes. As he sat in captivity, Kruger reflected on the irony. They had captured fuel in hopes of prolonging the fight, but in doing so, he had witnessed the true scale of their enemy's strength. For the first time, he saw the war not as a soldier, but as a man who finally understood futility. The Battle of the Bulge would end in failure for Germany. Over 100,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of tanks and vehicles were lost, many not to enemy fire, but to empty fuel tanks. The offensive that was meant to change history had only hastened the Reich's downfall. Colonel Hans Kruger's story became one of many forgotten tales from that winter. He survived the war and returned to a nation in ruins. For years he never spoke of the captured fuel, but those who knew him said that moment, standing beside 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, marked the day he understood the truth. The war had never been about bravery or destiny. It was about reality, and reality had long since turned against Germany. The captured fuel was not salvation, it was revelation. It showed the imbalance between two worlds, one of scarcity, one of abundance. In the end, the flames of Stavelot burned more than gasoline. They burned the last illusion of victory. The story of Colonel Kruger reminds us that wars are not only fought with bullets, but with logistics, industry, and the will to sustain them. The capture of 50,000 gallons of American fuel was a momentary triumph, but also a mirror, reflecting the inevitable collapse of a once mighty empire. History is filled with such moments, when one man's small victory reveals a nation's impending defeat. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more untold tales of war, courage, and the fragile human truths hidden within history.